Yo, what up? I've got a little bit more of a healthy pink glow on my face in this video. If you've been watching my videos regularly, you know that I've been recovering from extreme jet lag since going from the west coast of Canada to the middle of Germany. And I've been trying to cope with that jet lag by going to the gym a lot. But it also came down with a really nasty cold flu type of virus. And today is maybe the first day that I've recovered from that. So, nice to see you again, YouTube. I'm going to respond to a few things that Pausanian said about mental illness and mental health. As Francis Bacon said, it's always better to begin with concrete examples of these things, and only later to move on to general statements of theory or principle. So to get to the heart of it, I used to live in a charming country called Cambodia. In Cambodia, right up to the 20th century, and including the wars Cambodia is still infamous for, wars in the 1960s, 1970s, and so on, warriors would kill their enemies, cut open their abdomens, and bite into some of their organs. I forget now if it was the liver or the kidneys, but it was one specific organ that gushes hot blood when you take it out of your enemy's body. And this was considered not only normal, but virtuous. Good in this culture. Is that insane? There were journalists and war correspondents who witnessed this. I've read accounts, and who were horrified at the barbarity of it, and they couldn't believe whatever the year was. They said, what, this is 1965 or whatever year they were there, and these people are still doing this thing that seems like it comes out of the pages of a history book from, I don't know, thousands of years ago. And this type of intense warrior culture, along with what you could call a death ritual or a blood ritual, I don't know what you want to call it, this existed alongside and in the context of Orthodox Theravada Buddhism. This recently in a conversation with a professor, I actually pointed this out, that while I have many critiques of Buddhism, very often in these cultures, what Buddhism competed with, the other religious views that existed alongside it, were so bleak and so terrible, involving human sacrifice, animal sacrifice, and other rituals, that inevitably you sympathize more and more with Buddhism as some kind of civilizing force, at least as a force that's directing people to minimize the amount of violence they indulge in. As Marcus Aurelius says, the question is, are we to be sane or insane? In Cambodia, right up to the 20th century, at least until the 1940s, probably later in some areas, they had gladiatorial games. They had men who didn't disagree with each other, men who didn't hate each other, fight to the death, just for public entertainment. This is often kind of glossed over or avoided when people give very flattering histories of what we now call kickboxing, Muay Thai, and so on. That actually these were blood sports that were fought for the ultimate prize, that were fought for life and death, and for no particular reason. It was applauded, and people enjoyed it as a public spectacle, and saw no problem with it. Seems insane, but these were widespread, publicly sanctioned, socially sanctioned forms of insanity. I've read accounts, again, from the 20th century, fully 100 years ago, or a little bit more than 100 years ago now, from Mongolia, a very different culture, but again, a culture where Buddhism is a dominant influence, where, men are applauded for behavior that we would consider insane, that would, definitely land them in a mental hospital, even if they were serving in the U.S. military today. But again, despite the ostentatiously Buddhist culture of Mongolia, out in that part of Asia, with the wars that were unfolding, there was also a warrior subculture and various forms of, what we might call blatant insanity were held up as virtues, as things to be imitated. So to some extent, what we perceive to be sane and what we perceive to be insane is socially conditioned. And in some ways, the modern Western capitalist world is hyper-conformist. Anyone who can't conform to the demands of their workplace is very rapidly perceived to be insane. If you work in an office Anyone who can't every day from 9 to 5 keep up with the expectations that are imposed on them comes to be perceived as insane very quickly. That's true in many different workplaces across the board. There are very few walks of life where there's any latitude or lassitude for someone to be a little bit offbeat, a little bit eccentric, without being branded insane. And of course, the exceptions are celebrated in film and television and fiction. Yes, if you work in the arts, if you're a sculptor or a painter, then you may get away with some eccentric behavior. But other than that, for the vast majority of us, anything that takes a step to the left or the right out of what's expected of you and what's demanded of you is pretty soon regarded as insanity. Now, Pausimian brings a particular lens to this issue. He's speaking in a way that tries to motivate people and uplift people. And he says that from his perspective, mental health problems are electable. They are something you can get out of. They are something that in the moment you have control over. Now, in terms of what is socially perceived as insanity, I'm sure he has found that to be true in many instances in his life, because we perceive so many things as insane that are not really insane. But if you read much pilloried works like the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual, every sophisticated intellectual is familiar with the critiques, attacking, and denouncing this foundational work of modern biopsychiatry, but nevertheless, when you read those descriptions, I'll mention two of the hard criteria that would here dispute or controvert or cause a problem for Pausimian's optimistic assessment of mental health problems. Two criteria are very simply worded as compulsion and interruption. Look, you may have never in your life observed truly compulsive behavior. But a compulsive behavior, whether it's in a person who is sane or insane, is by definition something they cannot stop themselves from doing, even if they are aware of it. So you can have compulsive behavior that a person is not aware of, but then even if you, observing the person doing it, try to stop them and speak to them and make them aware of what they're doing, they still can't stop doing it. Even if they've been through therapy and discussed it, even if they've reflected on it, even if they've written a journal about it, even if they've published a book about it. Compulsive behavior, by definition, is what they can't stop themselves from doing. And depending on what walk of life you're in, you may go through your whole life without really observing this phenomenon within human nature. But truly compulsive behavior, absolutely by definition, and I have seen it, that is something that is outside of the remit of Pausimian's optimistic statement that you can liberate yourself in the moment, you can change your character, you can change your direction, you can overcome the ties that bind you to your mental health problems. Interruption, in the strict sense that you find it in the DSM and other, psychiatric literature, I suppose. Interruption is a really interesting and useful criterion to point out. When you talk about, for example, alcoholism, the meaning of, let's use cigarette addiction. You can observe someone who is trying to quit smoking, who's intensely addicted to nicotine, and they've just started trying to quit smoking. And while driving a car with no cigarettes, they come to a point where they absolutely cannot continue driving the car because of they are experiencing interruption as a symptom of nicotine withdrawal. Okay? Many other forms of drug addiction, likewise, have very clear forms of interruption. Now, how they deal with that interruption may be many things. They might get out of the car and go buy a pack of cigarettes. But even if you stop them and tie them up in a straitjacket, they are going to go through a period where they cannot return to that normal function. They can't drive the car. They can't just ignore it and keep doing what they're doing. So this is actually a really interesting criterion, because some things that we refer to as addiction, people do not experience interruption in withdrawal symptoms for. So, people talk about today pornography addiction. But do you ever have a scenario where someone is driving their car and they suddenly can't continue to drive their car anymore because they need to have access to pornography? I believe the answer is no. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe someone's doing a scientific study right now and saying, no, there really are these forms of withdrawal comparable to a chemical addiction or what have you. Now, not all forms of chemical addiction have interruption as an aspect. But interruption, I mean, it's very obvious. I remember reading a detailed study of arachnophobia, a very simple form of mental disorder in many ways, sort of compared to other things. But you have someone, I remember one of her symptoms was she absolutely could not get into her car because of the fear that there were spiders in the darkness hiding inside the car. The only way she would enter her own car was if she first sprayed it with insecticide and waited for the choking cloud of insecticide to clear out of the car. And what was it? In that case, when her husband tried to force her, her husband just hustled her into the car, put her into the car, without spraying it with insecticide, she experienced extreme interruption, and she actually kicked through the glass window because she was so terrified. Okay, so compulsive behavior is one thing, interruption is another. I don't know if I ever had the kind of optimism that Pausimian expresses here, that you can overcome your mental health problems in the way he describes. In a sense, I wish I did. I wish I had that optimism. Under the DSM, the grouping of what are called personality disorders. If you have met and spent time with people who truly have personality disorders, then you're often looking at a lot of compulsive behavior. And you may be talking to someone who's otherwise highly rational or highly reflective. Not everyone, but some of them are. They may be able to articulate what their mental health problems are, and yet they remain powerless over those compulsive behaviors. And you can take, if you're not a professional, if you're not a psychiatrist or psychotherapist, you can take any attitude you want to take towards it. You can be sympathetic or you can not be sympathetic. You can be contemptuous. On a case-by-case basis, whether or not you feel any empathy for the person who's going through this is up to you. But I think that empirical experience of spending time with people like that, people with personality disorders as an example, would really convince anyone that no, you can meet human beings who definitely are powerless over things they have knowledge of, they have understanding of, even when they exhibit maybe tremendous self-discipline and introspection in other aspects of their life. So the one sense in which I want to agree with Pausimian is that in normal everyday life, you do meet people who exhibit behaviors that are considered insane, that socially qualify as being insane in an informal sense. But in fact, these behaviors are strategies. They're strategies in the sense that they're behaviors people elect to engage in for a given objective, even if they have been engaging in them for so many years that they have come to appear compulsive, that they've come to appear to be an innate part of their own character. It's very common, even amongst teenagers. You can meet people who've engaged in certain types of behavior because it got their parents' approval, because it got the attention of the opposite sex, because it got them attention, period. And maybe they engaged in these behaviors, these mannerisms when they were 6 years old, and they were still engaging in them at 16. But when you get a little bit older than that, those behaviors start to not just seem childish, they start to seem insane. That's quite common. And it's both deceptive to perceive those things as an innate part of the person's character, and I think it's also deceptive to think of them as true compulsions. And very often in my own life, I've people who've been close to me and not even that close to me. I've sometimes really engaged with philosophical discussions with people where by the end of the discussion they realize that something they're doing, something they're saying, even a political ideology they're espousing, really is a kind of unexamined strategy they've been engaged in for so many years that they lost their grip on the edges of it. They'd forgotten why they were engaging in or what the objectives were, and maybe they'd forgotten really how inappropriate it was to engage in that behavior in some circumstances, in contrast to others. I admit I was thinking about this recently for totally different reasons from the ones Paul Simeon raises or engaged with. It is sad for me to see so many people with small political differences perceiving each other as insane. And those political differences, although they may be small, may be totally impossible to navigate. In the United States, people who support abortion almost never eat lunch with people who oppose abortion. It's what we call a watershed issue in politics. When I was in Taiwan, people who support Taiwanese independence never eat lunch with people who support Taiwanese reunification. Whether you think of these issues as being left-wing versus right-wing, normally in any given culture you're living in, there are hard and fast criteria people apply to politics, and they never talk to anyone on the other side, or often they jump to the conclusion that anyone who disagrees on this particular issue that matters so much to them, anyone who disagrees is insane. That's sad for me to see, and I see it even with my own professors. One of my professors has an extreme view on immigration politics. And that professor she definitely won't eat lunch with you. She will basically dismiss you as insane if you disagree with her, even though really at least 98% of the people of Canada would not agree with her view. I think it's above 99%. And I've seen polling data, because we do have polls about what people's opinions are on immigration law and what have you. So even though she's in a tiny minority on that political issue, she regards anyone who disagrees with her as insane. I've also spoken to feminists who are extremely opposed to pornography. And they think that anyone who tolerates pornography is insane. Simply anyone who doesn't share their extreme view that it should be illegal and exterminated. Doesn't even mean you have to like it, but anyone who even tolerates it, they would never eat lunch with, would never socialize with, the crowd insane. So that comes back to my earlier point of the extent to which perceptions of sanity and insanity, as Marcus Aurelius says, the question of whether we are to be sane or insane, the fundamental philosophical question, it becomes an invidious game, and people tend to lose sight of the extent to which their categorization of others is socially conditioned, whether that's socially conditioned because they grew up in Cambodia, or maybe it's socially conditioned because in the last 10 years, the only people you've been talking to are other feminists who agree with you, or other people who are a member of your particular political faction, people who agree with your political opinions on some obscure issue. That's an ugly side of human nature. But at the same time, I've had enough experience in politics. I have seen insane behavior that really looks insane, compulsive, extreme behavior exhibited by people. But I can tell it is not truly compulsive behavior. It is something they're doing as a strategy, even if it's become second nature to them, even if it's become so familiar to them. And the way out of that, if they can become aware of it, if they can become aware of their own motives, it is eluctable simply by questioning the reasons why they're doing what they're doing. Human nature is flexible, frighteningly flexible even. And the same people who in Cambodia would go to watch two men kill each other in a public battle to the death, on another day of the week they would go to a Buddhist monastery and meditate and chant a sutra about how you shouldn't even kill a mosquito and you should live a life of complete nonviolence. Human nature is malleable. And that is probably what makes us so uncomfortable when we're confronted with the reality of personality disorders and compulsive behavior. Because that is exactly an exhibition of an aspect of human nature that is not malleable, that people are powerless over, that refuses to change and that refuses to be changed, even when the person is aware of it, and even when they're sincerely trying to improve.